Hey, welcome to Tail Fluent. Today, we're learning English through a fascinating story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. Now, let's dive into the story of Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was born Iosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili on December 18, 1878, in the small town of Gori in the Russian Empire, now part of Georgia. His earliest years were filled with hardship and struggle. The modest home in which he was born was steeped in poverty, and even as a child, he experienced the sting of deprivation. His father, Vissarion Djugashvili, worked as a cobbler and was known for his unpredictable temperament and frequent bouts of heavy drinking, while his mother, Ketevan Galadze, was a pious and hardworking woman who strove to provide for her children despite the constant challenges. In this environment of discipline and deprivation, young Iosif learned early about the hardships of life and the importance of strength. Even as a child, he absorbed the harsh realities around him, experiences that would later shape his uncompromising nature and steely resolve. Growing up in Gori, Stalin attended the local church school, where he was exposed to formal education for the first time. His days were spent in simple classrooms, where the lessons were stern and the atmosphere austere. Yet, within this structured environment, he discovered a keen intellect and a drive to understand the world beyond his immediate circumstances. The rigid discipline of the school, combined with the stark differences he observed in the treatment of people from various walks of life, sparked in him a growing awareness of the inequalities that plagued his society. These early experiences instilled in him a desire to seek change, though at the time the idea of revolution was only a vague notion in his young mind. In 1899, as his political activities grew bolder, Stalin was expelled from the seminary. This expulsion marked a decisive turning point in his life, for it not only cut short his formal religious education, but also pushed him further toward a life dedicated entirely to revolutionary causes. With the loss of his position at the seminary, he began to fully embrace Marxist ideology, discarding the vestiges of his earlier religious instruction in favor of a belief system that promised to overturn the oppressive structures of society. It was around this time that he adopted the name Stalin, meaning man of steel, a moniker that would come to symbolize his iron will and resolve. From that moment, his destiny was inexorably linked to the revolutionary movement that sought to dismantle the Tsarist regime. As a committed revolutionary, Stalin threw himself into the clandestine world of political activism. He joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, a group that was itself divided between differing ideologies and strategies. Stalin aligned himself with the Bolshevik faction, led by Vladimir Lenin, whose vision of a disciplined and organized party appealed deeply to his desire for order and efficiency. His early revolutionary activities were dangerous and often involved covert operations such as distributing illegal pamphlets, organizing strikes among workers, and even participating in bank robberies intended to secure funds for the Bolshevik cause. His willingness to engage in acts of violence and his readiness to take risks quickly earned him a reputation as a fearless and dedicated revolutionary. The hardships he had endured in his early life only served to harden his resolve, and he soon became known among his comrades for his uncompromising approach to achieving their shared goals. Stalin's revolutionary activities soon brought him into direct conflict with the authorities of the Tsarist regime. In 1902, his involvement in subversive activities led to his arrest, and he was subsequently exiled to the remote and harsh regions of Siberia. In exile, the vast and unforgiving landscape of Siberia became a constant reminder of both the isolation imposed by the state and the resilience required to survive. Even though he was cut off from the epicenter of revolutionary activity, Stalin continued to correspond with fellow activists and to refine his ideas on how to topple the autocratic system. His time in exile was not wasted. It was during these years that he honed his skills as an organizer and propagandist, writing articles for underground newspapers and engaging in political debates with other exiled revolutionaries. The severe conditions of Siberia, with its bitter cold and isolation, only served to reinforce his determination to return to the struggle against the oppressive state. After several years in exile, Stalin was eventually allowed to return to the more populated centers of revolutionary activity. In 1912, he made his way to Petrograd, then known as St. Petersburg, where the political ferment of the city provided fertile ground for the Bolshevik movement. In Petrograd, Stalin immersed himself in the inner workings of the Revolutionary Party. He took on numerous responsibilities, from organizing workers' demonstrations to managing secret communications among party members. His organizational abilities and his willingness to take bold risks quickly elevated his status within the party. The bustling streets of Petrograd, alive with the energy of change and discontent, became the stage on which Stalin and his comrades prepared for the radical transformations that were to come. The year 1917 proved to be a pivotal moment in both Russian and world history. That year, the Tsarist regime of Nicholas II was overthrown in the February Revolution, marking the end of centuries of autocratic rule. The abdication of the Tsar created a power vacuum, which was soon filled by various political factions, including the Bolsheviks. However, despite this early success, the revolution did not immediately result in the establishment of a stable government. The provisional government that took power after the abdication struggled to maintain control, particularly in the face of growing discontent among workers, peasants, and soldiers who were eager for more radical change. This discontentment led to a second revolution later that year, the October Revolution, led by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Stalin played an important role in the October Revolution of 1917. While Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders, such as Leon Trotsky, were in the spotlight, Stalin was involved behind the scenes, working to secure key positions of power for the Bolshevik faction. Stalin's experience in organizing and managing clandestine operations became invaluable during the revolution. He worked on a variety of fronts, including securing arms for the Bolshevik forces and coordinating the party's propaganda efforts to rally support from the masses. When the revolution succeeded, the Bolsheviks took control of Russia, and Stalin's influence within the party began to grow steadily. The overthrow of the provisional government marked the beginning of the Soviet era, a new chapter in Russian history, and Stalin quickly positioned himself as one of the key figures in the new regime. Following the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks faced immediate challenges in consolidating their power. The country was in turmoil, with civil war breaking out between the Red Army, composed of Bolshevik supporters, and the White Army, made up of anti-Bolshevik forces, including monarchists, liberals, and foreign interventionists. The Civil War, which lasted from 1918 to 1921, was brutal and devastating, claiming millions of lives. During this period, Stalin was given several crucial military and administrative roles. He was appointed to head the defense of Tsaritsyn, later renamed Stalingrad in his honor, where his leadership played a significant role in the eventual Bolshevik victory in the region. Stalin's reputation as a tough and decisive leader grew during these years, as he was known for his ruthless approach to both the military and political challenges facing the new Soviet state. In addition to his military role, Stalin was also involved in the economic and political restructuring of Russia. The Bolshevik government, under Lenin's leadership, introduced a series of policies aimed at stabilizing the economy and securing the new regime. However, Stalin began to assert himself more aggressively within the party, advocating for policies that reflected his own vision for the future of the Soviet Union. He argued for the need to rapidly industrialize the country and to centralize power in the hands of the state, believing that this would strengthen the Soviet Union and protect it from internal and external enemies. Stalin's rise in power continued as he was appointed to key positions within the Soviet government, including the General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922, a post that would eventually give him control over the party apparatus and the ability to appoint loyalists to key positions. Following Lenin's death in 1924, the power struggle for leadership of the Soviet Union intensified. Stalin, having consolidated power within the Communist Party as General Secretary, maneuvered carefully to eliminate rivals and secure his dominance. Among his main competitors was Leon Trotsky, the charismatic leader of the Red Army and a key figure in the Bolshevik Revolution. Trotsky was a talented orator and military strategist, but Stalin saw him as a threat to his ambitions. Through political maneuvering, Stalin began to isolate Trotsky within the party, using his control over party appointments and the loyalty of his allies to undermine Trotsky's position. The struggle between Stalin and Trotsky eventually culminated in Trotsky's expulsion from the Communist Party in 1927. Stalin continued to consolidate his power by eliminating other potential rivals, such as Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, who had previously been key figures in the revolution. Stalin used a combination of political purges, propaganda, and the secret police to remove opposition, ensuring that only those loyal to him held power within the Soviet government. As a result, by the end of the 1920s, Stalin had become the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union, with complete control over both the government and the Communist Party. His political methods were harsh and often violent, but they allowed him to build a totalitarian regime that would dominate the Soviet Union for decades to come. Once Stalin had secured his position as the leader of the Soviet Union, he began to implement his vision for the country's future. He was determined to rapidly industrialize the Soviet economy and to transform the country from an agrarian society into an industrial power capable of competing with the Western world. To achieve this, Stalin introduced a series of ambitious five-year plans, starting in 1928. These plans focused on increasing the production of steel, coal, machinery, and other industrial goods, while also emphasizing the collectivization of agriculture. Collectivization aimed to consolidate small farms into large collective farms, which Stalin believed would improve efficiency and enable the state to control the agricultural output more effectively. However, the policies of collectivization were met with fierce resistance, particularly from peasants. Many were reluctant to give up their land and livestock, and as a result, Stalin's government resorted to brutal tactics to enforce compliance. Those who resisted collectivization were labeled kulaks, wealthier peasants, and were subjected to violent repression, including executions, deportations, and forced labor. The forced collectivization led to widespread famine in some areas, particularly in Ukraine, where millions of people died as a result of food shortages. Despite the human cost, Stalin pushed forward with his plans, believing that the long-term benefits would outweigh the immediate suffering. His policies succeeded in rapidly increasing industrial production, but at a tremendous cost to the Soviet people. The period of collectivization and industrialization was marked by extreme violence and hardship, but Stalin remained firmly in control, consolidating his power and solidifying his status as the central figure in Soviet politics. By the mid-1930s, Stalin's policies of rapid industrialization and collectivization had transformed the Soviet Union, but the cost had been immense. The country's agricultural sector was decimated, and millions of lives were lost to famine, repression, and the harsh conditions imposed by the government. However, the Soviet Union had also become a major industrial power, with cities like Magnitogorsk emerging as symbols of Stalin's vision for a modern, industrialized nation. Yet, even as the Soviet Union grew in strength, the political climate became more oppressive under Stalin's rule. In 1934, Stalin initiated what would become known as the Great Purge, a series of brutal campaigns aimed at eliminating perceived enemies within the Communist Party, the military, and the broader society. The purges targeted anyone seen as a threat to Stalin's absolute authority, including party members, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed, while millions were sent to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions. The purges also extended to the military, with many top generals and officers being executed or imprisoned. Stalin's paranoia grew during this period, as he feared potential conspiracies and plots to overthrow him. The Great Purge would devastate Soviet society, causing widespread fear and distrust, and leaving the country's leadership structure in disarray. Despite the chaos and suffering, Stalin's grip on power remained unshaken, as his control over the party and state institutions became even more entrenched. As the Great Purge continued into the late 1930s, the Soviet Union was transformed into a state where loyalty to Stalin was paramount, and any dissent was met with ruthless punishment. The purges were not limited to political figures. Ordinary citizens, including teachers, doctors, and even children, were caught up in the sweeping wave of arrests and executions. Fear permeated every aspect of society, and many people, including former allies of Stalin, were forced to denounce their friends and colleagues in order to survive. The Stalinist regime was characterized by a culture of surveillance, betrayal, and constant fear of arrest, with the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, serving as the primary tool for enforcing Stalin's policies. Despite the chaos created by the purges, Stalin's position as the leader of the Soviet Union remained largely unchallenged. He continued to focus on his goals of industrialization and modernization, pushing the country forward even as the internal political environment became increasingly repressive. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's leadership, emerged as one of the world's leading industrial powers, with a heavy focus on military production. Stalin's rule had brought both immense suffering and significant transformation to the Soviet Union, and as the country continued to grow, so too did Stalin's desire for dominance on the world stage. His policies and actions would have a lasting impact on the Soviet Union and the global balance of power, particularly as the world edged closer to another major conflict. As the 1930s drew to a close, Stalin's focus shifted toward preparing the Soviet Union for the possibility of war. The rise of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler and the increasing tensions in Europe were of great concern to Stalin, who understood the need to strengthen the Soviet military. In 1939, Stalin took a calculated step by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, a non-aggression treaty that effectively divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence between the two powers. This agreement allowed Stalin to secure the Soviet Union's western borders and delay a potential conflict with Germany, at least for the time being. The pact was controversial, especially given the ideological differences between the fascist regime of Hitler and the communist government of Stalin. However, Stalin believed that the Soviet Union was not yet ready for war, and this diplomatic maneuver gave him time to further prepare. The pact also had practical benefits, as it resulted in the Soviet Union gaining control of parts of Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland. However, Stalin's decision to align with Nazi Germany was short-lived. In June 1941, Hitler broke the pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. The surprise attack caught Stalin off guard and set the stage for one of the most brutal and devastating conflicts in history, the Eastern Front of World War II. The German invasion in June 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, marked the beginning of the most catastrophic and challenging period for the Soviet Union during Stalin's rule. The Nazis advanced rapidly across Soviet territory, capturing vast amounts of land and inflicting tremendous casualties on the Soviet military and civilian population. Stalin, who had been caught off guard by the invasion, initially responded with confusion and hesitation. His failure to anticipate the attack, despite warnings from his own intelligence agencies, led to widespread panic and disarray within the Soviet leadership. For several weeks, Stalin was in a state of shock, and many of his top generals were either killed or captured by the advancing German forces. As the German forces closed in on Moscow, the Soviet Union faced the real possibility of collapse. However, Stalin eventually took decisive action. He took direct control of the Soviet war effort, dismissing many of his generals and replacing them with loyalists. The Soviet government adopted a policy of scorched earth, retreating while destroying anything that could be of use to the German army, including factories, infrastructure, and crops. Meanwhile, Stalin appealed to the patriotism of the Soviet people, calling for a united front against the invaders. His speeches, while often filled with hyperbole and fear, became powerful rallying cries that galvanized the Soviet population. The Soviet Union, despite its initial setbacks, began to mount a fierce resistance. The turning point of the war on the Eastern Front came in the winter of 1941 to 1942. The Soviet military, with the help of reinforcements from Siberia, launched a counteroffensive against the Germans outside Moscow. The harsh Russian winter, combined with the stubborn Soviet defense, halted the German advance. The defeat at the Battle of Moscow was a major turning point in the war, and it marked the beginning of the Soviet Union's push to drive the Nazis out of their territory. Stalin, although often criticized for his purges of the military in the pre-war years, was able to unite the Soviet people and lead them in a long and bloody struggle for survival. The Soviet Union would go on to play a decisive role in the defeat of Nazi Germany, but the cost of the war was enormous, with millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians losing their lives. The Soviet Union's success in turning the tide against Nazi Germany was marked by significant battles and strategic victories, the most famous of which was the Battle of Stalingrad, which took place from 1942 to 1943. The battle, named after the city of Stalingrad, now Volgograd, was one of the largest and bloodiest confrontations in history. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, laid siege to the city, expecting to capture it quickly. However, the Soviet Red Army, under the leadership of General Vasily Chuikov and with Stalin's direct orders, mounted a fierce defense, refusing to surrender the city at all costs. The battle became symbolic of Soviet resistance as the harsh winter, house-to-house combat, and encirclement tactics eventually led to the defeat of the German forces. This victory was a major turning point in the war on the Eastern Front and marked the beginning of a Soviet offensive that would push the German army back all the way to Berlin. Following the victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet Union continued to gain momentum. The Red Army launched a series of offensives, recapturing much of the territory lost in the early stages of the war. In 1944, the Soviets liberated Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, further weakening the German hold on Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Stalin made sure that the Soviet Union's role in the war effort was firmly established in the eyes of the global community. He coordinated with the Allied powers, the United States and the United Kingdom, in what became known as the Grand Alliance. Despite tension with the Western Allies due to ideological differences, Stalin was able to secure substantial aid and supplies through the Lend-Lease program, which helped sustain the Soviet war effort. The Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazi Germany became central to its post-war reputation, and Stalin was increasingly seen as a key leader in the Allied victory. By 1945, the war was nearing its end. The Soviet Union's advances were unstoppable, and the Red Army had pushed into Germany itself. In April 1945, Soviet forces reached Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany. The Battle of Berlin was fierce and marked the final stage of the Eastern Front's military campaign. The city was heavily fortified, and both sides suffered tremendous casualties. But after days of brutal fighting, the Soviet forces, bolstered by superior numbers and firepower, captured the German capital. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allied forces. The Soviet Union had played a pivotal role in the defeat of Nazi Germany, and Stalin's leadership was hailed by many within the Soviet Union as a triumph. However, the victory came at an enormous cost. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians had died, and much of the country was left in ruins. Stalin's post-war actions would set the stage for the next phase of the Soviet Union's history, including the Cold War with the United States. After the victory over Nazi Germany, Stalin's attention shifted to securing the Soviet Union's influence over Eastern Europe and preparing for the post-war world order. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The three leaders discussed the post-war reorganization of Europe and the establishment of the United Nations, but it was clear that Stalin was determined to ensure that the Soviet Union had control over much of Eastern Europe. Stalin's demands for a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe were largely met, and soon after the war's end, Soviet-backed communist governments were established in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. This marked the beginning of what would become known as the Eastern Bloc, a group of socialist states under Soviet influence, which would remain in place for much of the Cold War. At the same time, Stalin's relationship with the Western Allies began to deteriorate. Tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, along with the United Kingdom, grew as the geopolitical landscape shifted. The ideological differences between communism and capitalism became more pronounced, and Stalin's aggressive expansionism in Eastern Europe caused alarm in the West. The United States, under President Harry S. Truman, became increasingly suspicious of Stalin's intentions and began to adopt a policy of containment, aiming to prevent the spread of communism. This shift in relations between the former allies marked the beginning of the Cold War, a period of intense political and military rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States that would last for several decades. Stalin, for his part, was determined to strengthen the Soviet Union's position, both domestically and internationally. He continued to focus on the internal consolidation of power, ensuring that the Communist Party remained firmly under his control. In the years following the war, Stalin's policies were aimed at further industrializing the Soviet Union and rebuilding its war-torn economy. However, these efforts were often marked by repression and brutality, as Stalin's government continued to maintain strict control over every aspect of Soviet life. The Stalinist regime was characterized by a pervasive atmosphere of fear, with the secret police continuing their work of surveillance, arrests, and executions. Meanwhile, Stalin's health began to decline, and by the early 1950s, it became clear that the leader who had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for decades was in the final stages of his life. Stalin's health began to deteriorate in the early 1950s, but he remained in full control of the Soviet Union as he continued to oversee its domestic policies and international relations. During the final years of his life, Stalin maintained his tight grip on power, demanding total loyalty from those around him. He continued to push for rapid industrialization and was deeply involved in directing the Soviet economy, which was still recovering from the ravages of World War II. He also maintained a policy of harsh repression, even after the war, with purges of perceived enemies within the Communist Party and among the population at large. The atmosphere of fear that had characterized much of his rule persisted, and many people continued to be sent to labor camps or executed on Stalin's orders. As Stalin's health worsened, his political paranoia and distrust of his colleagues also grew. He began to rely more heavily on his inner circle, but even these trusted individuals were not safe from his suspicion. By 1953, Stalin's health had severely declined, and on March 5, 1953, he suffered a stroke that left him incapacitated. His death brought an end to his long and brutal rule over the Soviet Union. Stalin's passing left the country in a state of uncertainty, as the power vacuum he left behind was immense. In the days following his death, the Soviet Union was gripped by a mix of mourning, fear, and relief. The leader who had shaped the fate of the Soviet Union for over 3 decades was gone, and his legacy would be debated and contested for many years to come. Stalin's death also marked the beginning of a period of de-Stalinization, led by his successor Nikita Khrushchev, who sought to dismantle many of the oppressive policies and practices that had defined Stalin's reign. Khrushchev's famous secret speech in 1956 denounced Stalin's personality cult and the widespread purges that had occurred during his rule. The speech marked a turning point in Soviet history, as it signaled a shift toward a more moderate approach to governance, although the Communist Party still maintained tight control over the country. Despite Khrushchev's efforts to distance the Soviet Union from Stalin's legacy, the impact of Stalin's rule continued to shape Soviet politics and society for many years after his death. The fear, repression, and state control that had been central to Stalin's reign left an indelible mark on the Soviet Union and the broader world. The legacy of Joseph Stalin remains one of the most contentious aspects of 20th century history. On one hand, he is credited with transforming the Soviet Union from a largely agrarian and underdeveloped country into a major industrial and military power, capable of defeating Nazi Germany and becoming one of the 2 superpowers in the post-war world. On the other hand, his rule is also marked by immense suffering, with millions of people dying as a result of purges, forced collectivization, famine, and political repression. The brutalities of Stalin's regime left deep scars on Soviet society, many of which endured even after his death. In Russia and former Soviet republics, Stalin's legacy remains divisive, Some view him as a strong leader who played a key role in defeating fascism and modernizing the Soviet Union, while others see him as a dictator whose policies resulted in untold suffering and loss of life. For many, the memory of the millions of victims of Stalin's purges, the forced deportations, and the man-made famines remains a painful reminder of the darkest chapters of Soviet history. In recent years, there has been a growing debate in Russia about how to remember Stalin, with some individuals and political groups seeking to rehabilitate his image, while others insist on acknowledging the full extent of the atrocities committed under his rule. Internationally, Stalin's legacy continues to provoke debate. His role in the defeat of Nazi Germany is undeniable, and the Soviet Union's influence over Eastern Europe during the Cold War was a defining feature of global politics for much of the 20th century. However, Stalin's aggressive expansionism and totalitarian rule set the stage for much of the Cold War's ideological conflict between communism and capitalism. His policies contributed to the deepening divide between the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, and the Western powers, led by the United States. The tensions between these two spheres of influence would shape global politics for decades, culminating in the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the Cold War and the conclusion of a long era of Stalin's legacy dominating the political and social landscape of Eastern Europe and beyond. However, the impact of Stalin's rule continued to shape the newly independent countries of the former Soviet Union as they grappled with the aftermath of decades of totalitarian control. In Russia, the transition from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented system led to significant social, political, and economic upheaval. Despite the end of Stalin's direct rule, the Soviet institutions and the culture of state control that he had built remained deeply ingrained in Russian society. In the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian leaders faced the challenge of reconciling the legacy of Stalin's rule with the demands of modernization and democratization. While some sought to distance the country from Stalin's totalitarian past, others began to argue that the stability and strength that Stalin had brought to the Soviet Union should be acknowledged, even if his methods were criticized. The debate over Stalin's legacy was further complicated by the rise of nationalism in Russia and other former Soviet republics, where some saw Stalin as a symbol of Soviet power and a unifying figure, while others saw him as the architect of immense suffering and oppression. The Russian government under Vladimir Putin has, at times, embraced elements of Stalin's legacy, including the emphasis on strong central leadership and the glorification of the Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazi Germany. In contrast, the broader international community has largely focused on the human rights abuses, mass executions, and political purges that defined Stalin's rule. The complex and contradictory nature of Stalin's legacy ensures that discussions of his life and rule remain deeply divisive, with different groups continuing to interpret his impact through various ideological lenses. As time passes, Stalin's legacy remains a topic of ongoing reflection, debate, and contention, with no easy resolution to the questions it raises about power, governance, and the cost of progress. As time moves on, the continued interest in Joseph Stalin and his reign is not just limited to historical discourse, but has also found its way into the cultural and educational realms. In Russia, debates about Stalin's legacy remain part of public life, with new generations encountering differing narratives about his leadership. While younger Russians may not have directly experienced the era of Soviet rule, they still learn about it in schools and engage with it through media and political discussions. In recent years, there has been a resurgence in interest in Stalin's leadership, with some viewing him as a necessary figure in Russia's history who brought strength to the nation, while others continue to view him as the personification of tyranny and oppression. The Russian government under Vladimir Putin has made efforts to both acknowledge and manage the complexities of Stalin's legacy. On one hand, Putin's administration has sought to rehabilitate some aspects of Soviet history, highlighting the achievements of the Soviet Union, particularly its victory in World War II, and the contributions of figures like Stalin in that context. At the same time, the darker chapters of Stalin's reign, such as the purges, the repression, and the famine, are sometimes downplayed or framed in a way that emphasizes the challenges of leadership during wartime and the importance of national unity. This selective view of Stalin's legacy has led to criticisms both from within Russia and from international human rights organizations, who argue that it risks minimizing the suffering experienced by millions during Stalin's rule. In other former Soviet republics, Stalin's legacy is viewed with even greater suspicion and resentment. Countries such as Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states, which suffered directly under Stalin's policies of forced collectivization, purges, and mass deportations, continue to wrestle with the impact of his reign. In Ukraine, the memory of the Holodomor, the man-made famine that killed millions of Ukrainians in the early 1930s, remains a highly sensitive and contentious issue. The recognition of the Holodomor as a genocide has been a point of political contention, not just in Ukraine, but also in relations with Russia. For many in these countries, Stalin is remembered as a symbol of oppression, and efforts to honor his legacy are met with fierce opposition. Globally, Stalin's impact on the 20th century continues to shape discussions of totalitarianism, human rights, and the use of state power. His rule is often invoked in comparisons to other authoritarian regimes, with historians and political theorists analyzing the methods by which Stalin maintained control over the Soviet Union. His purges, the extensive surveillance state, and the use of fear and propaganda are often cited as key elements of totalitarian governance. As the world reflects on the atrocities committed under Stalin's regime, the focus on human rights abuses, political repression, and the cost of ideological purity continues to be a central theme in understanding his legacy.